Today's video was going to be about this Eric Johnson kind of lead tone that I put together this morning with the HX Stomp, but the Line 6 Pod Go arrived in the post, which I found yesterday for a pretty good price, so I decided to buy it just to check it out, because I've had people asking, am I going to do some videos with the Pod Go and make some presets for it, and so basically I caved. My initial feeling was I can do pretty much everything that the Pod Go can do with an HX Stomp or a Helix, but the same isn't necessarily true of the Pod Go. We'll go into some reasons. Curiosity got the better of me, and so I bought this now, and at the moment I think the Pod Go is about £100 cheaper than the HX Stomp in the UK, so if price is a thing and a factor, then that might be one reason why the Pod Go might win for you. So I guess we could talk about the things that the Pod Go is missing first. So it doesn't have MIDI capability, as far as I'm aware. I can't see any MIDI ports. So for instance, if you're running like a MIDI rig, the Line 6 Pod Go probably wouldn't be your best bet, as that can't necessarily integrate like the HX Stomp can. The other thing is that the signal routing is fairly fixed, so you've got, like, although you've got more blocks that you can play around with, they're actually kind of fixed in place. You've got a certain amount before the amp and a certain amount after, and things like the EQ, the wah and the volume are always fixed in place, so that's something to bear in mind. Whereas the HX Stomp, you've only got 6 blocks at the moment. I think soon that's going to be 8. I don't know what I was doing with my hands there. But you've also got a opportunity to have signal path B, so you can have A and B. So you could have parallel amps, or you can have parallel delay, reverb. So although you're limited by the 6 blocks, you do have a bit more flexibility in terms of where you put those blocks, which is useful for some applications for sure. And it's something that I use with the HX Stomp, so it's not just a feature that I never use. I do use parallel delays and reverbs, and particularly, for instance, for that freeze sound that you might have heard me doing, where I sustain a note and then can sort of play over it, and it's like an accompanying thing. And then there's a few like models of stuff that you won't get in the Pod Go. Some of the really kind of DSP heavy ones, like the King of Tone model, and I think some of the amp models, and maybe the Rochester comp. Unless that might have gone into the update, I'm not sure, but I think they're also going to continue to update the Helix and HX Stomp with new stuff, whereas the Pod Go, I think, is going to have less frequent updates, and possibly some of those new models won't come across. So those are the negatives as I see them. Let's talk about the positives then. I say negatives, they're not really negatives, it's just features that aren't shared between the two. For me, the Line 6 Pod Go, in terms of a gigging unit, is probably far more capable than the HX Stomp. You've obviously got 3 buttons on the front of the HX Stomp, and whilst you can have modes, like you can switch between presets, or you can switch stomp mode basically, or snapshot mode, so I use snapshot mode. I've only got access basically to 3 sounds in snapshot mode. I can have a clean, a lead and a rhythm, and that can get me through a gig, and then I use the delay mix on an expression pedal. Recently-ish in a video, but before I got a chance to gig with this, I did experiment with using like a dual foot switch as well, to give me sort of 2 extra foot switches, so I could get the tuner and maybe even turn on and off the delay. But it's relatively limited in that sense. So yeah, if you are gigging like me, I'm going to assume that you're probably going to need 3 kind of sounds. You're going to need a clean tone, a rhythm tone, and a lead tone occasionally if you're taking solos. This is kind of, I think, a fairly typical wedding-y setup. Basically, whatever band you're in playing guitar, you're probably going to need a few core tones. And so when it came to doing things of interest, like maybe you need a dotted delay, or maybe a harmony for a part, that was more difficult to achieve with the HX Stomp, because you'd have to press in up or down, pressing 2 pedals at a time to get to another preset, or whatever, however you choose to kind of set that thing up. So it was kind of encouraging me more to the side of simplicity, rather than trying to really figure out if I could use it to do this certain job, because I didn't want to be pressing on pedals and stuff throughout the gig and risk switching to the wrong preset and stuff, and it's quite a small screen. With the Pod Go, one of the super cool things about it is you've basically got some of the foot switching capabilities of the Helix. So you've got this mode foot switch, which puts you between stomp mode and whatever mode you had before. So I think I've got it on preset or snapshot mode, but then you can switch on and off individual pedals. So that for me is super useful. So I could have a clean patch and switch in and out the delay. Let me just show you that quickly. So here I've got a clean patch that I've just put together, so I can just switch off the delay. So that's super cool, and then I can just press mode again and I can switch to, for instance, other snapshots or other presets. So if you press the bank buttons at the same time, you get into this preset mode. So I could, for a gig, as I say, if I've got 4 kind of key sounds, I've now got 4 presets as well in the same sort of area, A, B, C and D. Sorry, I'll just move that a sec. A, B, C and D, not in that order obviously. So I could have a rhythm on A, a solo on B, a clean on C, and then another clean on D, perhaps without a delay, or maybe a slightly boosted. But that's kind of super cool. So at the moment I've got a lead down here. So that's pretty cool. I've also got a volume pedal which is always on if I need it, and a wah pedal that's always there if I need it. Whereas with the HX Stomp, I wouldn't generally bother with that because it's taking up a block when, frankly, I don't have the bandwidth to use a block for wah and use a block for volume. Most of my presets sort of use 4 or 5 blocks already, and so for me that was kind of a waste of a block. I could either just use the volume on my guitar or just not use a wah at all. So that's kind of a cool thing. The other super cool thing, I think, is this amp out feature, which I'm hoping they're going to update, and I'll just explain how I'm going to use it if I can. But so when I was gigging with the HX Stomp, sometimes I'd take out a real amp with me as well, and I'd tap off that parallel path kind of just before the amp, so that I could have some of the effects or boosts that are happening before the amp going into a real Mezza amp. And that helps to kind of get that feel on stage, and generally just brings a bit more fun to the gig. This has an amp out feature which you can change to be between the amp and the cab, or be basically just another at the end of the signal chain. So you could use this into the return of your real amp, bypassing the preamp section of your amp, but still have those things like the volume pedal or anything that you've got before the amp on the Pod Go. What I'd like is to be able to tap that before the amp as well, so that I can use the preamp section of my Mezzas and use the line 6 to boost the front of it or whatever, but also have the Pod Go sending to front of house. That would be something that would seriously make me consider taking the Pod Go out instead of the HX Stomp. I've not gigged the Helix much at all, just because generally I have a kind of space issues in the car when I'm going out to gig. But that would be a super useful kind of thing. If I could take the Pod Go, I can send the amp out to the front of the amp, tap it before the amp. At the moment, obviously, I'll just have to send it into the amp return. And then I've also got the effects loop free to do other stuff with. Whereas on the HX Stomp, if I'm sending to the front of the amp, basically I've already used up the effects loop. So that's a super cool feature, I think, of the Pod Go. The only other minor gripe that I've thought of is that post cab, you've basically got 3 effects blocks that you can use, but one of them is apparently always an EQ, which is not my preferred option. So post the cab, you've got an EQ block which is always there, and then after that you've got 2 blocks that you could use. So for my Eric Johnson style clean, I like to have a delay, then a chorus, then a reverb. So I can't replicate that fully in the Pod Go, so that's a minor gripe. So in terms of flexibility, you have to be a bit selective about how you're using it, even though you've got more blocks. Some of them are fixed, so it's not necessarily all the way to Helix, but it's a little bit more flexible than HX Stomp in some ways. And I think it's probably fair to say it's definitely more giggable than the HX Stomp, depending on how you're using the HX Stomp. But yeah, if you're using it like I do, going direct to front of house and having this is your main sort of board, and not messing around with too many pedals and stuff, I think the Pod Go, actually having sat down with it and played it now, is probably a really good choice. I'm going to do some more stuff with it. Hopefully this is vaguely interesting and useful. If you want to leave in the comments the tones of mine that you want me to replicate in the Pod Go from my other Helix stuff, go for it. You can get any of the sounds that you heard in this video in the description, and also for the HX Stomp or Helix. But yeah, that's going to be my sort of project. I'm going to start working on getting some of my tones recreated for the Pod Go, so if you've got any preferences, then do let me know. But hopefully this was vaguely useful, and if you could like and subscribe, that'd be cool. If you got anything useful out of this video, there's a buy me a coffee link if you wanted to support me. But don't feel like you have to do that at all. Only use it if you've got something useful and if you can afford to. I'll catch you for another video soon, and thank you for stopping by.